There are new satellite images that show the stalled 40-mile-long Russian convoy near Kyiv that we've been talking about now for days. It has largely dispersed and redeployed. Some of the units there have now repositioned into forests and tree-lined areas. So what does that mean? Let's bring in retired Army Major General James Spider-Marks to talk about this. Can you show us what these pictures are telling us and what it means for where these tanks are going?
Yeah, I think this is frankly good news for the Ukrainians. We've had that imagery of that convoy, 40-mile-long convoy, now being dispersed, which means supplies are not getting into where they need to go. There's a change in tactics, and they're getting off the road networks because they're concerned about imagery like this and also some potential targeting. So what you can see in this image is they're still on the road networks. But when you look over here, you can see the tracks. They're off the major roads. And then specifically here as well, Brianna, you can see where there are a number of tanks or armored personnel carriers that are now getting off those main avenues of approach for protection.
It looks as if they've gone into a field behind a house.
Sure.
So they're seeking cover, basically?
Completely. What they're looking for, there's two things. There's, without getting inside too much military stuff, but it's cover and concealment. This is concealment, which means I want to get under trees, I want to tuck in next to buildings, I want to make it hard for anybody to really see me. Cover gives me protection from firing. In other words, big barriers and overhead cover that would really protect from bullets and missiles and rockets and artillery.
So that may be a good indication for the Ukrainians that they feel vulnerable, but could it also be an indication that they're getting ready for something?
Clearly what they're doing is the Russians felt very vulnerable on that major avenue of approach. The whole world could see that they were stalled, they weren't going anywhere, and you can't do anything when you're just lined up. You begin to disperse your units. Individual units like this can suddenly, non-commissioned officers and junior officers can get their troops together and begin to prepare for the next mission. You have a very difficult time when you just have this line of ducks on a road. So this gives them an opportunity to prepare. I see this in two ways. One, they're looking to protect themselves, to limit the amount of intelligence that can be derived from this display of vehicles on a major highway. And it also gives them an opportunity to prepare for the next move.
Joining us now is CNN military analyst and former Army commanding general in Europe and the 7th Army, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. General, I want to get to that satellite imagery, that new imagery that we've gotten of that infamous 40-mile-long convoy near Kyiv that we've been talking about for the better part of a week now. When you look at this imagery, it is now largely dispersed. What does that tell you about the force of that convoy and the potential impact that it could have on Kyiv?
Yeah, it tells me a couple things, Alex. First of all, that they have moved off the road and established what's called in military parlance a lager. They want to get under trees to try and establish some kind of camouflage. And they're doing this but because they have been gradually picked off while sitting on this road by the weapon that we're going to hear more and more about, the Bayraktar drones. These drones, these little killer drones, are going to be the signature weapon of this war, much like IEDs were of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They have been highly effective, but the Ukrainians don't have many of them. They had about 50 at the start of the war. They're trying to increase their supply of those because they have been so good in picking off these kind of targets in a very quiet manner. The Russians don't know they're coming. But going into the trees causes another problem. Okay, so you get out from the long stack of vehicles on a road, which can be hit by drones. You move into the trees to try and establish camouflage. Then you are very susceptible to ambushes from weapons like the Javelin missiles or the smaller range AT-4 missiles or some of the other ones that that NATO has given Ukraine to go against these armored targets. So truthfully, the Russian vehicles that are moving either on-road or off-road are subjected to multiple weapon systems. And truthfully, I don't think moving off-road is going to help them all that much. But the important thing to remember is they're still there. They are stuck. They have been forced into a channelized position where the end of the column has been prevented from turning around and the front of the column can't go anywhere. So they are stuck in a location And the Russians desperately need the resupply from those trucks, but they're not getting to the places they need to go to. As Jim Sciutto just said, they're trying to establish supply operation bases. They can't do that right now with that convoy.
General, more generally, as we've seen this Ukrainian resistance being quite effective on the ground, we've seen the Russians stepping up their bombardment from the skies, whether it's artillery or ground-based missile launchers or just bombing from their aircraft. So what does that tell us about where Russia feels they are in this fight now 2 weeks into this invasion?
Well, that's what they'll continue to do, Alex. They will attempt to continue to use long-range weapons for terror purposes, for chaos, to put the Ukrainians on sort of a horns of the dilemma. Do you protect the citizens that are being illegally targeted from these long-range weapons, or do you establish a resistance and an insurgency and a guerrilla war against the forces of Russia coming in? You know, what we have to talk about is the distances for these kind of weapons. When you're talking about mortars, it's a few miles. For artillery, it's around 17 to 25 miles, depending on the ability to shoot. For rockets and missiles, it's anywhere from 30 to 500 miles. So the Russians can stand off the target while they surround these cities with forces on the perimeter and hit the civilian targets from very far away. For a major city, they could combine MLRS, the multiple launch rocket systems, with Iskander or Caliber from very long distance. For smaller cities, they're just going to hit them with harassing artillery and mortar fire. Again, all to terrorize, cause chaos, and force the Ukrainians to peel off security forces from the fight against Russia to help the civilians who are being killed and injured in these cities.
General, I want to ask you about what we were just talking about with our Jim Sciutto, these two attacks, or rather these attacks on these two cities, Dnipro in the center, and then Lutsk here in the west, not too far from where I am right now. What do you see? What do you read into that when you see the targeting of these areas that we haven't been talking about as much in the past 2 weeks?
Yeah. Again, Alex, additional harassment. You can take an artillery or a missile or a rocket and swing it without a whole lot of effort from one city to another. So what the Russians are attempting to do is cause terror and chaos throughout Ukraine. But what I would suggest is they haven't sent any forces to some of these cities. So they are harassing them from afar with overhead fires. And again, the artillery and missiles are a much greater percentage than the air power. So Russia can't fly just yet. They would like to hit more and more city, but you know, if you're in Dnipro as an example, and suddenly you think you're in a safe area and you start getting hit with overhead fire, the chaos and the terror from the citizens of that city will say, holy smokes, we got to get out of here too. And again, it contributes to what Russia is attempting to do. They are attempting to force a humanitarian disaster. They're attempting to cause citizens to get out of cities so they have an easier way to occupy or take over those cities. And they are, in fact, just trying to cause casualties because that draws manpower away from any kind of resistance effort. If you're treating casualties, if you're trying to get food and water and electricity to citizens who don't know what's going on, then you can't really establish a great resistance because you're using military manpower to help the civilians survive. So I would expect more of this for cities we haven't seen Russian forces around. They will continue to swing artillery and missiles to cities where Russian forces are not close by because they can't support those with supply convoys. All of these things will contribute to continued, just chaos within Ukraine.
Right.